So many of you asked for a part 2 of the Iron Seal, and here it is. This one is for everyone who wanted to know what happened next, for those just joining us. In January, a records clerk named Elara Voss pressed her palm to a cold iron seal in the eastern corridor of Varenhold Keep, not out of ceremony, but because the draft was coming in and her hands were full. The seal had not lit in 412 years. It lit. What followed was a genealogical table connecting her mother's family to the founding Alpha Queen's bloodline, a council hearing she walked into carrying documents, and the formal collapse of a petition filed against her by the Alpha King's consort designate. Her family's house was reinstated on paper. She was given a larger workroom. She agreed to stay, not because the seal had chosen her, but because he asked, and because he had begun, slowly and in his way, to tell her things. It is now summer. The seal glows when she passes it. His wharf follows her. Some things have changed, not enough of them. This is part 2. The estate records were not where they were supposed to be. This was not in itself unusual. Records went missing in keeps for 100 mundane reasons. Misfiling, water damage. The particular entropy of paper in cold stone buildings over long decades. Elara had spent 7 years locating things that had drifted from their correct positions through negligence or time, and she had developed a systematic approach to finding them that involved working outward from where something should be and narrowing the possibilities until she arrived at where it actually was. What was unusual was the pattern. She had noticed it in the 3rd week of summer, while conducting a routine audit of the property ledgers from the period surrounding her family's dissolution. She was not looking for anything in particular. The audit was part of her regular quarterly work, the same work she had been doing in various forms for 7 years, and she had added her family's relevant period to the queue without particular urgency. The council had reinstated her documentation in the spring. The procedural question was settled. She was not, she told herself, looking for anything, but she noticed the pattern. The records from the decade of her family's dissolution were present in some years and absent in others, not the random, scattered absence of ordinary loss, but a specific, selective absence. Years of routine inventory. Present. The year of the dissolution itself. Present but sparse. The entries brief where they should have been detailed. The 2 years following, almost entirely absent, with only a handful of documents surviving, and those documents the least informative ones, the kind you kept if you were keeping up appearances and discarded the rest. She sat with that for a long time. Then she began working outward. The records that should have documented the transfer of her family's estate, the inventory of assets, the formal deed reassignment, the valuation records, were not in the property ledgers where they belonged. They were not misfiled in adjacent years. They were not in the overflow storage in the lower archive, which was where documents ended up when someone ran out of shelf space and stopped caring about organization. She checked the duplicate records kept by the council's own administrative office, which were maintained separately as a safeguard against exactly this kind of loss. The duplicates were missing too, both copies from both locations. In the same specific years. She set down her pen and looked at the gap in the shelf in front of her. The physical absence where a full decade of her family's property history should have sat. The empty space that someone had left behind when they removed the things that would have told the truth about what had happened. And she understood. With the clarity that came from 7 years of reading records and knowing what their silences meant, that this had not been negligence. Someone had worked very hard to make sure there was nothing left to return. She did not go to him immediately. This was deliberate. She had a habit developed over years of working alone with difficult information, of sitting with a finding long enough to be certain she had understood it correctly before she acted on it. Premature action on incomplete understanding was the source of most of the errors she saw in the Keep's institutional records. Someone had drawn a conclusion one step before the evidence warranted it, and the conclusion had hardened into record before it could be corrected, and then it was no longer a conclusion, but a fact. And facts were very difficult to unmake. She was not going to make that error with this, so she worked. She spent 3 days in the lower archive, and 2 in the overflow storage, and 1 in the administrative records room that the council's clerks used, and which she had access to by virtue of her position and 7 years of being invisible enough that no one had thought to restrict her. She pulled everything adjacent to the gap and read it. She mapped the absences against the presences. She found 2 documents that had survived, not because they had been protected, but because they had been misfiled in a ledger from an entirely different region of the Keep's property holdings, the kind of clerical error that occasionally preserved things that were meant to be lost. Those 2 documents told her enough. The estate had been valued at the time of dissolution. The valuation was significant, not the holding of a minor house, as the remaining records suggested, but a substantial property with productive farmland and a formal deed of crown tenure that predated the dissolution by 2 centuries. The kind of holding that, under the Keep's own property law, should have been held in trust pending legitimate heir documentation rather than absorbed directly into Crown holdings. It had not been held in trust. She found the name of the council member who had overseen the dissolution proceedings. She found it in a procedural footnote in one of the surviving documents, listed as the presiding official for the administrative transfer. She checked the council records from that period. He had served for 14 years. He had retired with considerable property holdings of his own. He had been dead for 11 years. She set the 2 surviving documents on the corner of her desk and tied them with a strip of ribbon and looked at them. Then she went to find the Alpha King. He was not in the council chamber, which was where she usually found him in the mornings. He was not in the eastern corridor or the great hall or the training yard. She found him eventually in the upper archive, the one above her own workroom which she had not known he used, standing at a long table with a map spread open in front of him and Cassian Rove at his left shoulder, both of them looking at something in the Northern Territories with the focused attention of men who had been looking at the same problem from different angles for some time. She stopped in the doorway. Cassian saw her first. He looked at her face, then at the documents under her arm, then back at her face, and something in his expression shifted in a way that was too quick and too controlled for her to read completely. He said nothing. The Alpha King looked up. He had the particular quality of attention she had come to know, not surprise at her presence, but immediate focus, the way a man orients toward something that matters to him before he has consciously decided to. He straightened. "Elara, I apologize for the interruption," she said. "When you have time, it is not urgent." She paused. "It is significant, but not urgent." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Cassian, and something passed between them in the way things passed, between men who had worked together for a long time and had developed a shorthand for it. Cassian rolled the map with the practiced movements of someone who had rolled many maps, tucked it under his arm, and left the room with a brevity that suggested he had somewhere else to be and had decided to be there now. The Alpha King waited. She came to the table and set the 2 documents down and untied the ribbon and spread them flat. And she walked him through it the way she had walked the council through her bloodline documentation in the winter, without drama, without performance, as a report. The audit, the pattern of absences, the systematic nature of the gaps, the 2 surviving documents, and what they established, the valuation, the crown tenure deed, the procedural footnote with the presiding official's name. He did not interrupt. He read the documents when she indicated them. He was very still in the way he was still when he was thinking seriously about something, not the stillness of inattention, but the stillness of a very large amount of processing happening below a composed surface. When she finished, the room was quiet. The presiding official, he said, has been dead for 11 years, she said. His estate passed to his family through normal succession. I have not looked at the composition of that estate. I thought that was your territory rather than mine. He looked at the documents again. At the valuation figure. At the tenure date, 2 centuries before the dissolution, before anyone currently living had been born, before the decision had been made to treat her family's holding as something that could simply be absorbed and forgotten. How long have you known, he said. 5 days. And you worked it out yourself? It is what I do, she said. I find things. He looked up at her then, and his expression had the quality she had learned to read over months of mornings. Not the closed, institutional face he brought to council chambers, but the other one. The one that was only present in rooms where it was only the two of them. It was not soft. It was simply honest. Elara, he said, I am sorry she had not expected that. Not the apology itself. She had expected eventually some form of institutional acknowledgement. But the directness of it, the simplicity, no procedural framing, no conditional language, just, I am sorry. She looked at the documents on the table between them, at the valuation figure. At 2 centuries of crown tenure, reduced to an administrative footnote by a man who had retired comfortably and died 11 years ago, and would never answer for any of it. It was not your doing, she said. It was done in this keep, he said, under this crown that makes it mine to address. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the upper archive's narrow windows, the summer courtyard was bright and unhurried, the way it was in the mornings before the day's work accumulated weight. She could hear, faintly, the training yard below. I know you will address it, she said. I am not here because I doubted that. I am here because you needed to know, and because... She stopped. Because, he said. She looked at him. Because I have spent my entire life watching things that belong to my family exist somewhere I could not reach them. My mother spent 30 years watching it. She never got it back. And I decided when I found those documents that I was not going to carry this alone for another 5 days while I waited for the right procedural moment. She held his gaze. So I came to find you. The room was very still. He reached across the table, not to the documents, but to the space beside her hand where the ribbon lay. He picked it up and set it straight, a small, precise movement that had no practical purpose. She understood it for what it was. I'll need Aldrin, he said, and the council's property advocate, and someone who can locate the records from the presiding official's estate transfer. He looked at her. I will want you to be present for the findings, if you are willing. I kept the records, she said. I should be present when they're corrected. Yes, he said, you should. Lady Varenhold came back to Varenhold Keep on a Thursday in the middle of summer, which Elara knew because Cassian mentioned it with the particular studied casualness he used when he was conveying information he thought she should have, and was uncertain how she would receive it. She received it the way she received most things, without visible reaction, with a note made in the relevant mental file, and with the intention of addressing it when it became necessary 2 days later. She was in the lower corridor, near the administrative offices, when she saw Lady Cole coming toward her from the direction of the council wing. There was a moment, brief, perhaps 2 seconds, in which both of them registered the other's presence, and made the silent calculation that people make when an unavoidable conversation announces itself. Lady Cole's step did not slow. Neither did Elara's. They stopped at a distance that was neither intimate nor hostile. The corridor was empty. The stone was cool. From somewhere further in the wing came the muffled sound of a council clerk dictating to a junior the ordinary soundtrack of the keep's administrative life, indifferent to what was happening in the corridor. Lady Cole looked as she always looked, entirely composed. She was wearing grey, which suited her in a different way than the dark blue of the council chamber had suited her, less formal, more deliberate. Her hair was pinned simply. She had the manner of a woman who had decided before leaving her rooms that morning exactly how she intended to conduct herself today, and had not deviated from that decision. "Elara," she said. "Lady Cole." Elara said a brief silence. Not uncomfortable, more the silence of two people who are both precise with language and are taking a moment to select the correct opening. "I am here to file for a formal release from the consort-designate arrangement," Lady Cole said. "I expect the proceedings will take 3 days. I intend to be straightforward about them." She paused. "I thought you should know, since it will require a council session, and your name will inevitably be part of the record." "I appreciate that," Elara said. Another silence. Lady Cockle looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who had spent years reading rooms and the people in them. Elara held it without difficulty. She had been holding difficult gazes since January. "You handled the council hearing well," Lady Cole said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was an observation made with the precision of someone who assessed things accurately, regardless of whether the accuracy was convenient for them. The documents were well chosen. The presentation was controlled. "You filed a well-constructed petition," Elara said. The gaps were there, but the structure was sound. Something moved in Lady Cole's expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, swiftly managed. "I did what the situation required, as did I," Elara said. They looked at each other. The council clerk's dictation continued in the distance. A door opened and closed somewhere in the administrative wing, and footsteps went past the far end of the corridor and faded. "May I ask you something?" Lady Cole said. "Yes." "Did you know, before the seal lit, what you were?" Elara considered the question. It was the honest version of the question, she thought. Not the procedural version, not the version with an agenda behind it, but the real one. The one Lady Cole had perhaps been carrying since the winter. "No," she said. "I pressed my hand to the iron to stop a draft. I had my hands full, and the door was letting in the cold. I had no idea." Lady Cole was quiet for a moment. 3 years, she said, not with self-pity, simply as a statement of fact. "I spent 3 years building something I believed was solid." She looked at the middle distance, then back at Elara. "It was solid. It was simply built on a foundation that had already shifted before I began." "I know," Elara said. "I am sorry for that." Lady Cole looked at her sharply, the look of someone who had expected many responses and had not expected that one. "You have nothing to apologize for, I know," Elara said again. "I am still sorry for it." A longer silence. Lady Cole straightened. A small, barely perceptible adjustment, the kind of movement that was not about posture, but about something internal being settled and put away. "He is not easy," she said. "He's not going to become easy." "You understand that?" "Yes," Elara said. "I am not easy either." Something in Lady Cole's expression shifted, genuinely this time, the managed composure giving way briefly to something that was almost warmth. "No," she said. "I don't imagine you are." She inclined her head, not the formal council inclination, but something smaller and more personal. Elara inclined hers in return. They went their separate ways down the corridor, and Elara did not look back, and she thought that this was the most honest conversation she had had with another woman in Varenhold Keep in 7 years, and that it had happened with the woman she had been most prepared to dislike, and that this was the kind of thing that the records never captured, but that was nonetheless true. The investigation into the estate records took 6 weeks. Elara was present for the findings, as he had said she would be. She sat at the long table in the upper archive with Aldrin and the council's property advocate, a meticulous woman named Sarit, who had the air of someone who took institutional errors as a personal affront and pursued corrections with the energy of a long-running grievance, and she watched as the full picture was assembled, piece by piece. From the records that Sarrett's office located in the presiding official's estate transfer documentation, it was worse than the two surviving documents had suggested. The estate had been valued at nearly 3 times what the sparse dissolution records implied. The productive farmland alone was significant. There was a secondary holding, a smaller property, an hour's ride from the main estate, that had not appeared in any of the records Elara had found, and that Sarrett's office had located in a completely separate ledger, filed under a different administrative category, as if someone had decided it was tidier. The presiding official had retired 2 years after the dissolution, with a property holding that, when mapped against the Keep's records from the preceding decade, represented an increase in personal assets that was difficult to explain through ordinary means. Sarrett said, in the dry, precise tone of a woman reading findings she had expected and found satisfying to confirm. This was not administrative error. No, said Aldrin, who had been in the Keep long enough to have been a junior archivist during the relevant period, and who had the specific expression of someone who had suspected something for a long time and was finding no pleasure in being right. Elara said nothing. She looked at the full picture spread across the table. The valuations, the secondary property, the timeline, the retirement that followed, and she felt something she had not let herself feel since January, when she had first understood what the gap in the records meant. Not anger. She was past the part of this that was anger. It was something older and quieter, the specific grief of understanding at last, the full weight of what had been taken. Not just from her. From her mother, who had kept a private ledger and raised a daughter in reduced circumstances and died without knowing the complete shape of what had been done. From the 30 years her mother had spent carrying a loss whose true dimensions had been deliberately obscured. She pressed her fingers flat against the table and breathed in and breathed out, and she did not let any of it show, because she was in a room with colleagues conducting an investigation, and this was not the moment. That evening, in her workroom, when the day's work was done, and the wolf was occupying most of the floor space, and the summer light was going amber through the 2 windows, she let it show. She sat at her desk, and she put her head in her hands, and she stayed there for a while. The wolf shifted and put its head on her foot, which was not something it usually did, and she left her foot there. After a while, she straightened. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. The Alpha King came to her workroom the following morning earlier than usual. She knew it was earlier, because the light was still low through the eastern windows, and the courtyard below was quiet in a way it was not by the time he usually arrived, and because the wolf, which had stayed the night in its preferred position at the left side of her desk, lifted its head with the particular attention it reserved for him specifically. He came in and sat down across from her, and he looked at her face. She did not perform composure for him. She had told him in January that she would not, that he would have to tell her things, real things, and she had held to that, and it had meant in return that she did not manage what he saw when he looked at her the way she managed it for everyone else. It was an exchange. It was one of the things they had built. He said, "How are you?" Not a question. Or not only a question, a statement of presence. "I am here and I'm asking." "I'm all right," she said. Then, "I'm not entirely all right." "I will be." He was quiet for a moment. "The secondary property," he said. "I saw Sarrett's full report last evening, as did I. Your mother did not know about it." "No," Elara said. "She knew about the main estate. I think she knew something was wrong with how the dissolution had been handled. She was not unintelligent, but she did not have access to the records to know how wrong. And by the time I had access to the records, I was looking for my own history, not for—" She stopped. "I did not know to look for the secondary property. I did not know it existed." He looked at his hands on the table. The old scars on his knuckles, the particular quality of stillness that was him thinking seriously about something he intended to say carefully. "I want to tell you something," he said. She set down her pen. "When Cassian brought me the initial report about the seal, in January, the morning of the first day, I looked at the records of the Eastern Corridor staff to understand who you were. You were listed as records, clerk, lower quarter. 7 years of service, no formal standing." He paused. "That was the complete entry. 7 years. A single line." "I know," she said. "I kept those records." "I am telling you," he said, "that I looked at that line and I moved on to the next question because a records clerk with no formal standing was not at that point a category I was considering." He looked up at her. "I had walked that corridor, not every day but regularly for years, and I had not seen you." She held his gaze. "You said this in January. I am saying it again," he said, "because in January I did not know about the estate. I did not know about your mother's ledger. I did not know the full shape of it." His voice was even, but there was something under the evenness, not emotion in the performed sense, but the specific weight of a man who had spent the night with a Sarret's report and arrived at a morning with something to say that he had decided to say plainly. 7 years in this keep, your mother's family in these records for 2 centuries. All of it reduced to a single line by someone who found it convenient to make you small. A pause. "I find that I am not able to simply address it procedurally and move on." The room was very quiet. Elara looked at him, at the grey eyes that held light rather than reflected it, at the scar along his jaw that was simply part of his face now, at the hands on the table that had spent a long time managing a great deal of power, and had arrived this morning at her desk to say this. "What are you able to do?" she said gently, the way she asked him things when the answer mattered. "I am able to give it back," he said. "All of it, the estate, the secondary property. The full valuation corrected and entered into the permanent record. Your mother's name in the documentation as it should have been." He paused. "And I am able to be angry about the fact that it needed giving back on your behalf. On your mother's." She was quiet for a long time. "That is enough," she said finally. "That is more than enough." He looked at her with the expression she had come to know was his version of relief, something that released, very slightly, in the set of his shoulders, in the quality of the grey. "Good," he said. The wolf's tail moved once, slowly, on the floor between them. The formal restoration of her family's property took another 4 weeks to complete. It moved faster than expected, which Elara attributed to Sarret, who had the energy of a woman correcting a decades-old institutional error and was not inclined toward delay. The presiding official's family was notified that a review of the original dissolution proceedings had identified irregularities. The specific details of those irregularities were entered into the permanent record. The estate and secondary property were formally transferred out of Crown Holdings and into the restored documentation of her family's house. Elara was present for the signing of the transfer documents. It was a procedural session, not a council assembly, just the relevant officials in a small administrative room with documents and ink, and the particular quiet of institutional formality. Sarret read the transfer into the record in her precise, unhurried voice. The Alpha King signed. The council's property advocate witnessed. Elara signed her own name at the bottom of the transfer documents, in the small, consistent handwriting she had been using for 7 years on the keep's records. She looked at her name there for a moment. Elara Voss, of the reinstated house. Her mother's family name in the formal record, as it should have been, connected backward through 2 centuries of crown tenure to a time before any of the loss had happened. Her signature on a document that gave back what should never have been taken. She set down the pen. No one in the room made anything of the moment, which was correct. It was a procedural session. It had procedural conventions. She followed them, but she held the weight of it on the walk back through the eastern corridor, past the seal that glowed its low amber as she went by, present, settled, unremarkable in the way of things that are simply part of how a place feels, and she held it on the stairs to her workroom, and she sat with it for a while at her desk before she opened the morning's work. Her mother's ledger was on the shelf by the door. She looked at it for a long time. He found her that evening in the upper archive, which had become, over the course of the summer, something like a shared space, not formally, not by arrangement, but in the way spaces become shared when two people independently choose to spend time in them, and eventually stop pretending that coincidence is as accident. She was at the long table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and a record she was reading with more focus than the record technically required, because the record was something to do with her hands while she thought about other things. He came in and sat at the opposite end of the table with a document of his own, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the summer evening moved through the windows in long amber slants that went slowly to gold. "The Northern Road Survey," he said eventually. "Better or worse than last year?" "Better." A pause. "I find I am less disappointed about it than I expected to be." She looked up. He was reading his document with the focused attention of a man who was also thinking about something else. She watched him for a moment. "I want to tell you something," she said. It was his phrase. She had not used it before. He looked up immediately. "I have been in this keep for 7 years," she said, "and I spent most of those 7 years being careful to want only what I could reasonably expect to have. It was a practical decision. It kept things manageable." She looked at the cold cup of tea. "I did not know about the estate. I did not know about the secondary property. I had trimmed what I allowed myself to want down to a size that fit what I understood my life to be." She paused. The documents that Saret found, seeing the full size of what was there, what should have been there, it is not only the property. It is the understanding that I had been told in every institutional and procedural way available that I was smaller than I was, and I had believed it. For 30 years my mother believed it, for 30 years before me. He was very still. "I am not telling you this because I want you to feel responsible," she said. "You did not do it. You are correcting it. I'm telling you because you told me things this summer that you had not told anyone, and I decided that was not a one-sided arrangement." The room was quiet. The gold in the windows was fading to the softer light of early evening. "You are not small," he said. "You have never been small. The people who told you otherwise were wrong, and they were wrong deliberately, and I intend to spend a considerable amount of time ensuring that the permanent record reflects that correctly." "I know," she said. "I believe you." "Good," he said, "because I am also going to be tedious about it." She looked at him. Something moved in her chest, the same warmth that was not the seal light, the quieter and more personal, and more hers variety, and this time she let it stay where it was, without filing it away. "You are often tedious about things you care about," she said. "I have noticed this. It is a quality," he said, "that I am told can be trying." "I do not find it trying," she said. He looked at her with the expression that was his version of ease. Settled, present, the specific quality of a man who has arrived at a place he intends to remain. "Good," he said again, and then, because he was himself and could not be otherwise, "The road survey figures are actually quite interesting. The eastern section show me," she said. He brought the document to her end of the table and sat beside her instead of across from her, which was new, not dramatic, simply closer, the natural adjustment of a distance that had been narrowing by degrees all summer, and he spread the survey figures between them and began to explain the eastern section, and she listened. And outside the windows the last of the summer evening settled into the soft blue of the keep at night. The deed arrived on her desk on a morning in late summer. She came into her workroom in the early light, the wolf at her heels in the way it had taken to walking with her rather than simply appearing in rooms she entered, and she found it on the center of her desk, a sealed document, the keep's administrative wax pressed with the formal property transfer. Seal, her name on the outside, in an official clerk's hand. She knew what it was before she opened it. She opened it anyway, because some things you open even when you know, because the knowing and the holding in your hands are different things. The deed was for the main estate. 3 pages of formal transfer language and legal description. The productive farmland enumerated in the precise terminology of Crown property documentation, the tenure dating 2 centuries back to the original grant. Her name, her family's name, the Alpha King's signature on the final page, and beneath it, in a hand she recognized, because she had been reading it in reports and on documents, and in the small notes he occasionally left on records, he thought she should see. 3 words. Yours as it should be. She sat down. The wolf arranged itself at the left side of her desk, in the way it had determined was the most efficient use of the available floor space, and its tail moved once, slowly, and she put her foot against its flank. And she stayed there for a while in the early light, with the deed in her hands and her mother's ledger on the shelf by the door, and the sound of the keep beginning its day in the courtyard below. She thought about her mother. About the private ledger, kept carefully for 30 years. About a careful, quiet woman who had recorded what she could not recover, and raised a daughter who had learned from watching her how to keep records of things that mattered, even when the official record said they didn't. About 30 years of carrying a loss whose full size had been deliberately hidden. She looked at the 3 words in his handwriting. She thought, "Mother, I found it." She did not cry. She was not, in general, a person who cried at things. And besides, she had work to do, and besides, what she felt was not the kind of thing that needed release. It was the kind of thing that needed to be sat with and held and eventually absorbed into the permanent record of who she was and what her life had been and what it was now. She folded the deed and placed it inside her mother's ledger between the last recorded entry and the back cover, where it could be found by anyone who looked. Then she opened the morning's work. He came later than usual that morning. She had begun to be able to tell from the quality of his lateness what kind of morning the council had given him. There was late because of Heron. Veld, which produced a particular quality of contained patience in the set of his shoulders, and late because of the Northern Territories, which was different, more focused, and late because of something he had not yet told her, which she was learning to recognize by the way he sat down. This morning was the 3rd kind. He sat down across from her and looked at her desk and at the morning's work and at the space where the deed had been, which was now empty because she had moved it to her mother's ledger. His gaze paused on the ledger, which was where it always was. On the shelf nearest the door, he looked back at her. "Sarit tells me the secondary property documentation will be complete by the end of the week," he said. "I know," she said. "She sent me the timeline yesterday. There is also the matter of your formal title within the keep," he said it carefully. Not as a council statement, but as a thing he had been thinking about and had decided to raise. "The reinstatement restored your family's documentation. It did not, in itself, assign you a position that reflects your actual standing. That is a separate determination. The council is prepared to." "I know what the council is prepared to do," she said. "I keep their records." He looked at her. "What do you want?" She considered the question seriously. The way she considered things, she intended to answer accurately what she wanted. Not what was procedurally available, not what was reasonable to expect. What she actually wanted, which was a question she had been relearning how to ask herself all summer. "I want to keep my work," she said. "The records. I am good at it, and I find it genuinely interesting, and I do not want to trade it for a title that sounds more significant, but means I sit in council sessions and manage the politics of people. I currently find it more useful to observe." She paused. "I want my name in the records as it should be. I want the secondary property documentation completed. I want to continue telling you when you are wrong, which will remain a regular occurrence." Something in his expression did the thing she had not had a word for until recently, which was, settle the way a room settles when the fire has been lit and the cold has been pushed back from the walls. "All of that," he said, "is manageable." "Good," she said. "There is one other thing," he said. She waited. "The council's formal language for your position in this keep," he said. "Currently it reads records, clerk, lower quarter, reinstated house, no formal rank." A pause. "I would like to change that." "To what?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the particular, careful deliberateness of a man who had chosen his words very precisely and was delivering them exactly as chosen. "To Elara Voss, of the House Voss, keeper of records, first of her name in Varenhold in this generation, attached to the household of the Alpha King by his request and her consent." The room was very still. "That last part," she said. "By his request and her consent, yes, that is not standard council language." "No," he said, "it is not." She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze with the greystone quality of his eyes, the specific density that held light rather than reflecting it. And he waited, because he had learned over the course of a winter and a spring and a summer that she needed time with things that mattered, and he gave it without impatience. "Yes," she said, "you may change it." Something moved in his face then, the same brief thing she had noticed first in the council chamber in January, after she had said, "I'll stay." Not a smile, exactly. The leading edge of one, honest and unguarded, gone before it fully arrived. She had been watching for it all summer. She was glad to see it again. "Good," he said. The wolf's tail moved on the floor. Outside the two windows, the inner courtyard was bright with the last of the summer light, the season beginning its slow turn toward autumn in the way of seasons that do not announce themselves, but simply arrive. The seal in the eastern corridor was doing quietly what it had always been meant to do. The ledger was on the shelf by the door with a deed inside it that had her mother's name and hers. It was, she thought, a very ordinary morning. There was work on her desk and tea that was still warm, and the particular quality of presence across from her that she had come to depend on the way you depend on solid floors. It was also, she thought, everything. Not in the way of things that announce themselves as significant, in the way of things that simply are settled and specific and hers, in a keep where she had spent 7 years being easy to forget, in a life that had been smaller than it should have been for longer than it should have been, in a morning that was, at last, the correct size. She picked up her pen. He opened his report. The wolf breathed slowly on the floor between them. Outside, summer moved toward autumn, and the keep went on in the way keeps do, patient, stone-built, holding the record of everything that had happened within it, the losses and the corrections, and the long, ordinary mornings that make up most of her life. The morning was hers. It was more than she had thought to ask for, and it was everything. And this time she did not set it aside. If you watched part 1 and came back for this, thank you. If this is the first you're hearing of, Elara and the Iron Seal, part 1 is waiting for you. And if you want to know what comes next, Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.